Thank you for joining us today for Planning and Leading Days of Service, a webinar for AmeriCorps VISTA leaders. I'm your host, Andy King, Senior Training Specialist at AmeriCorps VISTA headquarters. Our presenter is Malia Hadidian-Titchener. Malia works as the coordinator of Student Community Engagement Center at Portland State University. She also leads volunteer management trainings for the Northwest Oregon Volunteer Administrators Association. Before returning to service coordination within higher education, Malia worked at Hands-On Greater Portland, a local volunteer center, where she first served as an AmeriCorps member and then an AmeriCorps lead before landing a full-time position with the organization. It's always great to have an AmeriCorps alum with us. Welcome, Malia.
Thanks so much, Andy. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all about the ins and outs of planning for a day of service and how you all as VISTA leaders can put on meaningful, well-organized, and hopefully fun service opportunities. So we're going to start today by talking a bit about how to identify the why, or the purpose behind doing a service day, and why that why should be such a central question to your day of service planning. In addition to that, we will talk through how to determine the who, the what, the when, and the where of your day of service, and we'll share some great resources and examples to help support that how behind service project creation. How do you actually get it done? You'll be able to download a number of checklists and templates. I think they were already popped into the chat, but they'll be popped a few different times throughout today. And you can use those checklists and templates as you see fit as a follow-up to today's presentation. Finally, we'll take some time to highlight some key actions that leaders should take or be sure to at least address before, during, and after your day of service. So I want to start by quickly stating what we mean when we say a day of service. So typically a day of service is a set time, often a half or sometimes a full day, when individuals are brought together to volunteer with one or more organizations to address a community need. Service days are often centered around an issue, such as food insecurity, or they can be much broader in scope, focusing generally on the value of service or coming together as a community. Often these events are planned and kind of organized around a designated National Day of Service. And for AmeriCorps, that includes Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service in January and the September 11th National Day of Service and Remembrance. At other times of year, it's maybe going to make more sense to plan a day of service around a specific need of a community or an organization that you're hoping to work with. Whenever they fall, days of service can look very different depending on their size and scope. Based on your team's time and capacity, you might decide to plan a small project at a single site that engages just your AmeriCorps team, say working a shift at the local food bank. In other situations, a larger day of service is the goal, with multiple sites, a dedicated desire to really engage the public in service. So on that same theme of hunger, maybe a large-scale event would bring together dozens or even hundreds of volunteers at a central location for a breakfast kickoff with a keynote speaker, and then it would be followed by volunteers splitting into teams to tackle different service projects for the rest of the day, perhaps around the entire city. Both of these types of projects can be very impactful, both for the participants and for the organization served, if they are well planned and organized and with a clear purpose, or what I like to call the why behind the work. So why do we do days of service? We just saw that service days can vary widely in size and scope, and many of those design decisions actually stem from the reason we want to organize a day of service in the first place. It's really helpful to identify both your primary and your secondary whys in thinking about your day of service goals. So I want to look through a couple common ones. Most days of service at their core are designed to meet a community need through those support of one-time volunteers. So if we've already identified a specific community need that we want to address, that's going to be the driving force for how we organize our event. If we don't already have a specific need identified, often starting with a general theme like food security, disaster response, or environmental restoration can then set the stage for further identifying a project or a community partner to engage with. At other times, instead of starting with a need for service, you actually start with a need for relationship building. We may want to build connections between our members and the greater community, or we might hope to provide an opportunity to come together as a VISTA team and engage in something meaningful as a group. Either of these relationship-based needs can be big motivators behind day of service design. Service days can also be great opportunities for volunteers to deepen their understanding of key community issues and the work being done to solve them, And they can encourage the development of new partnerships, increased program visibility, and provide an easy way for people to get involved with your organization. So let's look at a couple examples from my work. This past summer, my team received an email from a city representative interested in getting students engaged in tackling the issue of trash in our downtown core. So in this case, our primary why came from a direct ask from the community to our team to help the city tackle a specific issue. Simultaneously, though, we'd already been thinking about doing a service project at the start of the school year to help build connections on campus among students returning in person for the first time in over a year, and to help them feel more connected or a sense of belonging to the downtown neighborhood where our campus is located. As we began thinking more about the event, however, a third why arose. Trash had become considerably more noticeable during the pandemic as services in the business districts were reduced and many folks lost housing and ended up homeless. Our team was concerned that some participants might be quick to blame trash on houseless populations without understanding the incredibly difficult nature of disposing of one's trash when you don't have access to resources like trash pickup and you often have to rely on single-use plastics. So our team decided it wanted to incorporate an educational angle as well into the project to bring attention to these issues. While the project may have started in response to that voiced community need, it morphed to include a number of different whys that drove its creation. On the flip side, another day of service we coordinated sprung from the desire to create a team building opportunity for students in a leadership program. In this case, we had a defined audience, and our goal was twofold. We wanted to engage the group to do some team building and get to know one another through a hands-on service project. And we wanted them to see what a well-run service project looked like, as they would be tasked with creating their own later in the year. So rather than create a project ourselves, we identified a local organization that was known for engaging in well-managed service opportunities, and it had a mission that aligned well with the interests of our group. The Children's Book Bank had regular opportunities to fix up gently used children's books to be regifted to kids at a local Head Start classroom. The books had previously been donated, so we didn't have to worry about that part of it. They just needed some love to make sure they looked as good as new. So we organized a team building activity and reflection activities as we traveled to and from the site to help our team build those connections. And we created a space for our students to debrief the project's strengths and challenges upon our return. In this case, our primary why was guided more by our relationship building and learning goals than it was by a specific community issue. But we made sure the work we were doing was meeting an actual need, and we were able to help the book bank in a way that worked for them. So those are just a couple examples, but I know there are likely some great examples in this group about the kinds of whys that can define our day of service planning. Andy's going to invite you to share your ideas next.
All right, so as Malia mentioned, we'd love to hear from you. And for this activity, we will use the chat feature. So if you've been involved in planning a day of service, or if you've attended and participated in one, what was the why driving that event? And there may be more than one why. So if you would, tell us in a couple words what the project was and what the why was behind it. And as a reminder, so that everyone can see your response, please be sure you toggle to everyone before you submit your response. And we'll give you just a moment or so to get your thoughts together and pop them into the chat. All right, so a couple of you have said either National Day of Service or MLK Day in particular was the why for doing it. All right, so here's one community painting project. And the why behind it was supporting arts and promote city beautification. All right, again, so we're looking for the why behind your Service Day project. Whether it was one you created or one you attended, what was sort of the purpose or the foundational reason for doing it? Let's see, so a trash pickup event to beautify the community so everyone can enjoy and appreciate our city. And here's another one, the purpose was to help VISTA members connect as a cohort. Let's see, Aria says, I'm interested in building community among my members since we mainly meet virtually and are spread out across the tri-state area. Caitlin says we planted 1,000 trees. My goodness, to help the environment and create natural space for the local school. Let's see, in 9/11 National Day of Service and Remembrance, a community garden cleanup, and setting up a gala. The why was volunteerism as a response to terrorism. I love that. And to focus on healthy futures, as food security is also a national security issue, right? And it's too narrowly understood. All right, appreciate all of these responses. If you're still working on yours, feel free to go ahead and submit it. But Malia, I'm curious to see what you noticed among these responses.
Yeah, totally. I'm seeing some great ones coming through, and I really see a lot of folks talking about that connection, right? Like if you have a company-based service day, oftentimes it's about bringing, coworkers out together to do something. There's a connection-based desire there. That's also coming through, and helping VISTA members connect as a cohort, helping connect if you're mostly meeting virtually, and this is an opportunity for you to come together in person. And then, yeah, a lot around those national days of service as well. And with those national days of service, I definitely encourage you to think about well, why do we even have a national day of service? And why are you choosing to engage with it? What are some of the deeper whys behind what you want to be doing with it? So I love, Jonathan, what you said, that why is volunteerism as a response to terrorism. We really want to focus on a healthy future. So great, awesome. Hopefully you're getting some new ideas as things come through for your own days of service. We'll kind of move on to the next section in thinking about some of the other pieces. So once you know your why, the next step in initial planning is to really look at these 4 other questions. We've determined our general goals, and now it's time to think about how our why can align with time, capacity, resources, and the relationships we have to work with, and also where we might be lacking. So we want to do a quick survey of our who, our what, our when, and our where to help us determine the shape and scope of our event. And from there, we'll talk about our how. Note that the why is at the center of all of these decisions. So as you begin to explore each of these questions, continue to ask yourself how they connect back to your identified goals. So let's start with the who. Who do you want to partner with? And who's going to be the beneficiary of the opportunity? Who do you want to participate? Who are the volunteers that you're going to get out? Who might you approach for funding if you need extra monetary support? Who do you have team members ready to step into leadership roles? Are there additional expertise areas that you might need to recruit for? So it can be helpful here to really revisit your whys for any partnership or relationship building goals that you identified to help determine who to include and how you want to include them. If your primary goal is to build that connection and cohesion with your AmeriCorps team, which I was seeing coming through there, you might decide to limit your participants to your team rather than opening it to the public. So hand in hand with identifying our why, our who, is to determine our what. So what can be done in the course of half a day or a day-long service event to address that identified why? The answer to this question, by and large, will be best determined in collaboration with your chosen community partners. Rather than deciding on a specific idea like, hey, let's do a book drive, and then shopping it around for who might need it, it's often better to reach out to your community partners first to ask them what their needs are and how a done-in-a-day project could best support those needs. And if you're going to be doing it for your own organization, you can go through the same process. Really look at your needs as an organization and go through that process. If you're looking to partner with an external organization, maybe you learn that a literacy organization is overflowing with book donations and could actually use a team to help sort them and organize their donations room. So it can feel exciting to come up with a brand new idea and brainstorm ways it could help the community. And there's nothing saying you can't go big and creative if you have the energy and capacity to do so, but just ensure that your project is meeting an actual rather than an assumed community need. The biggest thing I encourage folks to consider when deciding on a project is not to recreate the wheel if you don't have to. If there's an existing project out there that could be amplified by your efforts, it can be just as impactful, if not more so, to join in and contribute energy to a project already in progress, rather than pulling something together from scratch. So as you begin to home in on your partnership and project ideas, the question of when and where will naturally follow if it wasn't already determined from the start. In thinking about when a project should take place, if the date isn't already set in stone, go back to your why. What is the need you're trying to fulfill? When would a project make the most impact? For example, a winter coat drive might work best sometime in fall as folks are beginning to think about the start of colder weather, whereas a community garden preparation day may provide the best support in early spring to prep the garden for the planting season. It's also valuable to revisit your who to make sure that the time you choose will work for the folks you want to be there. If your project is designed just for your AmeriCorps team, maybe a middle of the work week project works great. If you're hoping to engage the public, weekends could be preferable. And if you're helping with a school beautification project, for example, it may only be possible during school breaks when kids and teachers aren't using the grounds. If you want to do, say, an outdoor painting project, helpful to also think about the weather. Is there likelihood for rain? Also, if it's winter, how much daylight do you actually have to work with? Finally, while national days of service may seem locked in on the timing front, it's still really important to do some research to figure out what else is already happening during those days. Does your service project have to fall the morning of MLK Day itself if there's already a huge speaker series planned in your area for that day? Maybe you can host your event later in the day, or the day before, or after, or even the following weekend, depending on what makes the most sense for everyone involved. At this point in the process, you might have already have a good sense of where the project will take place, if you've already identified that community partner and the project scope. But even if you already know where it's going to take place, there are still details to consider here. Are volunteers going to be centered in one location at the site, or are there going to be multiple projects going on simultaneously? How accessible is your location? That's both accessibility to wheelchairs, strollers, that sort of thing, as well as what transit options might exist to help folks get there if they don't have a car. Is there a space where you can gather the group at the start and at the end of the project for opening introductions and closing reflection? So many of these details are going to be further honed when you do a project site visit, which we're going to touch on later, but it can be helpful to start thinking upfront about your location considerations, especially around accessibility. So let's put these together and see how these questions might play out in practice. Earlier, I gave the example of the trash pickup event that my team was tasked with organizing. As a reminder, our guiding whys were we wanted to tackle the issue of trash downtown. We wanted to build connection among participants and a sense of connection to the neighborhood. And we also wanted to build awareness of the challenges of waste disposal for our houseless populations. From those whys, we then began to flesh out the structure of the event. For the who, we identified that our student staff would help plan, our student body was our target audience, and our main community partner would be an organization called Solve that specializes in trash collection events and could train our staff and provide supplies. We also determined that we wanted to include information and resources about organizations who were working with homeless individuals in the downtown area to help participants build more awareness around other ways they could get engaged in our downtown core. As we determined the what, our primary focus was definitely on the service itself. We wanted to do the trash pickup. We wanted to make sure that volunteers had ample time to actually pick up trash in the area. But we also wanted to make sure we could meet our goal of building connections between students. And we organized them into small groups and added a boxed lunch to our closing reflection to really encourage folks to stick around, share a meal, and connect after the project wrapped up. Finally, we started the project with a little education about the issues in advance to meet our goal of building awareness. We decided it would be easiest to engage group leaders in facilitating a smaller group orientation with their volunteers on both the environmental impacts of microplastic pollution, as well as the challenges of waste disposal for our houseless neighbors, before the groups were then sent off to pick up trash. For timing, we intentionally planned the event to fall the Saturday after one of the biggest outreach fairs for new and returning students, so that we would have an immediate opportunity for folks to get engaged in service and we could catch them before the school year got too hectic. And location-wise, made the most sense for us to start on our own campus, and we planned multiple different loops for different pods to take so they wouldn't overlap territory and everyone would end up back on campus where we could serve lunch. We also scoped one route in particular that was designed around streets that had accessible curb cuts so that anyone joining us using a wheelchair or stroller could participate. Thanks to having some clear whys, we were able to build out a vision for our project that actually met a number of our goals. But then the question turns to, how do we make it happen? What are some of the tools and best practices that can help guide your team in creating a well-planned and well-executed event? So as we begin to think about the logistics of planning our days of service, it can be helpful to put ourselves back into the shoes of being a volunteer and actually remembering, well, what worked and what didn't.
So we have another activity to invite your ideas. And this time we want you to think about a service project that you participated in as a volunteer. And what is one element you remember that helped the project to feel well organized, enjoyable, or impactful? So again, we'll use the chat for this activities. So if you have a memory of a service project, go ahead and share that. And we want to see what it is that stuck with us, right? So what elements really made the service project feel like a success? And again, be sure to toggle to everyone so that we can all see your response. And I'll give you just a moment to get your ideas coming in. All right, so Jackie first in says, there was actually enough thoughtful work for each volunteer. Yeah, that's a big one, right? No one wants to feel like their time is being wasted or that they came and there really wasn't a need for them to be there. So, so that I think is a really essential one. What other thoughts? What other elements did you see in a service project that really made it feel like it was well designed? Janelle shares lists, check-ins, having breaks, snacks. Snacks always appreciated, as well as good community engagement. Excellent. So a lot there to unpack in that one response. Jonathan shared that there was a dedicated volunteer manager that facilitated the day. Judy shares, I've been to several invasive species removal work parties on National Days of Service. The most successful had enough tools for everyone, appropriate training, and created one great big pile of the removed weeds for all of us to see our efforts. That is great. It sounds like something I'd really enjoy. Michaela shares pre-communication, right, with clear expectations, what to bring with you, and what would be provided. Awesome. Jillian shared, as a volunteer, I was educated highly on the service project and was able to answer any questions the participants had and didn't have to constantly call on a leader for more information. Excellent. All right, these are all great ideas. I'm sure you have more coming in. But Malia, I want to turn to you and see what stood out from your vantage.
Yeah, definitely. These are all really great and things that we'll be kind of talking about throughout our time together. I think one of the things that stands out for me is that first one of making sure that people have meaningful work to do and that everybody has meaningful work. And sometimes that means defining what is meaningful work and really talking about connecting it back to your why. For our trash pickup event, we really focused on microplastics because sometimes people are expecting they need to fill like 3 full trash bags for it to feel impactful. And when we did that education in advance to talk about, actually, here's what happens when these tiny little pieces of plastic get into our water supply, and here's the damage that can do, really helped to reorient people to what success looked like and what they were trying to kind of accomplish that day. So I think that's a really important one is both having the meaningful work and making sure people know what defines meaningful work. But yeah, love all of these opportunities and these ideas coming in. So this brings us to our next section of thinking about these details, right? So considering our how is probably just as important as all of the earlier questions combined, because it really is going to be your bridge between that idea and an actionable reality. And the first step in thinking through your how is to identify what resources you have at your disposal and also what gaps exist. So staff capacity considerations are a big piece of the puzzle. Who is on deck to help plan and promote, and how much time can you each realistically give? And what are the different roles that you need to have filled? How much time do you even have before the event? What supplies do you already have? And do you have budget to be able to procure additional supplies, food, or other needed items? Snacks, always helpful to have. So thinking through that. A well-organized, enjoyable, and impactful event with all of the components that you came up with in the chat there often requires a lot of legwork up front to ensure a smooth experience on the day of. So as you begin to ask yourself how you're going to bring your event to fruition, sometimes you realize things need to shift. For example, our trash pickup event, we had originally wanted to include this really awesome trivia tour to build volunteers' connection to our downtown area through some fun and historical tidbits, but turns out we had not given ourselves nearly enough time to add this piece in effectively. So we pivoted. We encouraged our group leaders to share a few fun facts as they walked and informally asked group members to share some of their favorite spots in the downtown area to attempt to meet that goal with a less involved approach. So if you know you need to adjust your idea, but you're unsure how, go back to that why. Remind yourself of the goals you were hoping to accomplish and explore ways to reach them within the capacity and resources you already have. Finally, it's incredibly helpful to think about what resources may already exist to help guide your planning. Has this kind of project been done before? Is there an existing model or blueprint you can work from? Or will you be starting something from scratch? This is where having some helpful guides and templates can be really useful. And that's what we're going to focus on sharing next. So there are two main resource packets that you'll walk away with today. The first is a very helpful resource created by a group of VISTA leaders like yourselves a few years back, and it's called the National Days of Service Project Ideas Guide. It has specific project templates you can use, and I'll touch more on this in a moment. There's also a packet of some of the how-to tools and resources that I've found most useful when planning days of service, including a list of example project roles, a project development checklist, a timeline template, a project description template, as well as a site visit checklist. So we'll be taking a cursory glance at these resources, as well as looking at a few key actions leaders should be sure to take. So if you and your team need help coming up with those initial ideas and kind of exploring, is this actually feasible? Check out the National Days of Service Project Ideas Guide, which offers this blueprint for how to plan and facilitate 5 different types of projects, from book drives to food drives to park cleanups. It has some great templates to work from, as well as a handy flowchart, which you can kind of see on screen there, that's going to help you identify which one makes the most sense for your team based on the amount of time you have to plan, what the weather might be, whether you have the capacity to fundraise if fundraising is necessary, and how many volunteers you think you can engage. Whether or not you choose to use one of these templates, an important consideration overall is what your role will be in the process as a VISTA leader versus the roles of your VISTA team members. So as a VISTA leader, you may be the point person to initiate a project or maybe propose a few ideas, but the decision for how to proceed with day of service planning might be a collective one, with your team working together to choose and plan a project collaboratively. At other times, your role may primarily be just to provide support, enthusiasm, and connection to a lot of these resources for VISTA members planning separate days of service at their individual sites. So even if you're not doing the service project development yourself as a lead, having a solid set of project planning resources and examples available to share with your members will set your teammates up for success. And it certainly might be the case that you are the primary person designing and leading a project in which your team members engage, maybe primarily as participants. This could be the case if you're planning an internal service day, especially earlier in your team member service year, where the primary goal might center around getting to know one another and building those connections as a team. Whatever the circumstance, it's helpful to clarify your role and those of your team members early on in the process, so you and your team are on the same page as planning moves forward. To help with this, in the resource packet, you'll find a list of common roles that you and your team might consider filling out to ensure that you have all of the important day of service roles and responsibilities covered. There are a wide range of roles with varying levels of responsibility on this list, from site liaison to logistics wrangler to the person taking point on fundraising. Some roles are completed up front, some take place over the course of the project, and many pertain primarily to the day of the event. This list is not exhaustive, but it does hit on some roles that sometimes get missed, so it should provide a good starting place in thinking about delegation of responsibilities. As a VISTA leader, it is part of your role to support your team members' professional development, and days of service can be the perfect opportunity to strike up those conversations with your team members, to talk about their strengths, their learning goals, and areas of growth. Where do they feel like their strengths lie? What do they want to learn? What have they said they want to work on in their professional development plans to develop future job skills? Roles can vary in responsibility and commitment. So consider how the day of service planning process can engage your team in identifying and selecting roles that really play to their strengths and help them hone their skills. In tandem with a list of possible roles your team might take is the consideration of the distinct tasks that often make up those roles. A good project development checklist can serve as your guide to think through some of the most common elements you might want to consider when planning a service day. The project development checklist included in your packet is divided into 3 sections: before the project, during the project, and then after the project, to really help you think through when different elements come into play. Use the checklist with your team as you think through your timeline and divvy up the roles for each phase of the project. Of course, each project is going to look different, right? So you might not be addressing all of these to-dos for your specific event. But having the checklist handy during your team planning meetings can help ensure key elements are not forgotten and help guide the delegation of tasks. So now the question is, how are you going to keep track of who's doing what? While a good project development checklist can serve as your guide to kind of brainstorming the tasks themselves, a task timeline gives you a structure within which to keep track of those tasks and what needs to be done by when. The example you see on the screen here is one that we used of a timeline to help plan that trash day. So most folks look at a timeline template like this and immediately try filling it out in order. Start with what you think you need to do first and go from there. I encourage you instead to try the backwards planning method of organizing your tasks. Backwards planning has you start by thinking about the actual event day itself and its evaluation, and work your way backwards, day by day and week by week, to flesh out what tasks need to be done. As you start working backwards, you might realize, oh, you need to adjust your time frame or reconsider your scope. However you choose to organize your tasks, make sure it's something your entire team has access to. There are, of course, more involved project management systems like Asana or Trello that can be used to track one's progress with timelines and reminders. But the best system is the one folks will actually use. So consider that when choosing your organizational tool. Backwards planning can be a great exercise for you and your team to engage in together, to think through what needs to be done and map out the different tasks each person will be taking on within a certain time period. This is a skill that so many jobs require, so the exercise offers an excellent opportunity to practice it together while building shared understanding and buy-in amongst your team. Finally, you'll find a resource in your packet about writing a good project description. Having worked at a volunteer center for nearly a decade, I can tell you many folks underestimate the value of writing a solid project description and a recruitment blurb designed to inspire engagement. If you're going to be recruiting external participants, you'll need to focus on getting the attention of those in the community that would want to get involved. So the template walks you through the elements to include, but I do want to highlight a few tips here. First, consider using verbs in the title rather than nouns to draw folks in. For example, prep books for kids with the Children's Book Bank often draws more people in than book cleaning event. Second, make sure your first sentence draws your reader in and connects to the why of the event. You might start with a question. Love reading? Want to make sure young kids get the opportunity to own books? Or you might start with a pertinent fact. For children in poverty, one of the biggest obstacles to literacy development, which begins at birth, is the scarcity of books in the home. From there, you can expand on the why and then connect it to the practicalities of the event: the who, the what, the when, and the where. Even if you're keeping the project just amongst your VISTA team, it's still helpful to put together a shareable project description to get folks excited about participating and ensure that everyone is on the same page about what's happening. Check out the project description template for more guidance on the kinds of details you might want to include in a project description and what you might want to highlight when putting together a catchy recruitment blurb. These are just some of the resources I've found most useful when planning days of service with my own teams, but I know there are other planning tools out there that many of you have probably used and likely found helpful.
Speaking of which, here's a chance to share whatever planning tools or strategies that you found helpful in planning a service project. What would you recommend others check out? These could be online resources, a specific practice or approach, or maybe a particular tool or template. So again, for this activity, we're using the chat. Make sure you send your ideas to everyone so that your colleagues will be able to see it. And a question to respond to is, what other planning tools or strategies have you found useful? And looks like folks are putting their thoughts together. Again, it could be a specific tool maybe that you've used, a checklist or a resource that you're aware of, or some sort of a template, or maybe it's just a generalized approach, or maybe it's a tip or a practice that you think is useful. All right, Jonathan has shared, he researched Agile project management to make a lightweight structure that focused on the servant leader, removing barriers to participation of the volunteers. So it sounds like you're using a particular type of tool or organizational structure to make it more accessible. And you use the Management Center's MOCA template, which we've talked about in a couple of other webinars in the past. And if you're not familiar, that is a template to identify others who need to be involved in a project and what their degree of involvement would be. So are they, see if I can remember this, are they managing an element, or are they consulted? Do they have some level of responsibility? All right, we've got a few more responses coming in. Caitlin says that they often use Smartsheet. It's like Excel, but you can delegate tasks to people and upload documents. It's become a lifesaver. Jennifer shared that they've used Sign-Up Genius, which is a website to help with volunteer sign-up for specific roles. Great, having an online registration site. Anne has said using Canva for promoting the events, right, to create some really visual or great eye-catching visuals there. Janelle shared several different tools here: Divi, Excel, Calendly, SurveyMonkey, et cetera. So all these online tools for calendaring, for getting surveys, or you can even use SurveyMonkey for registrations, and otherwise to do some role assignments and split up the work. Great, lots of different examples there, specific, very helpful. Malia, looks like some really useful ideas here. Anything you would add to it?
I think these are great. I'm going to look up that MOCA template. I hadn't heard of that before, so I'm writing that one down. And yeah, Canva, I feel like has leveled the playing field for creating some really nice graphics and posters and other things. It's very accessible and easy to use, has lots of great templates. So great suggestions. So from here, well, we're going to head into our final section. In thinking through some leader tips. So I wanted to share a few helpful project planning lessons I've learned over the years that continue to inform my work in service event creation, and which I hope will be helpful to you as VISTA leaders who will be planning and supporting others in planning days of service. So my first lesson learned, I encourage everyone to do a site visit in advance of the project to make sure you understand the location and the space, even when the project is at a location you think you're familiar with. So depending on the size and scope of your event, you and your team might want to think about physical layout of things, registration, parking, food, water. Where are there bathrooms, especially for outdoor events? Are there bathrooms? What are the weather considerations? Do you have shelter if it's gonna, rainstorm comes through? As well as determining your accessibility needs. One of my favorite examples of site visits and the lack thereof comes from a large service project that my colleague was helping to plan. So one of the sites was an ivy pole along a bike path, and it didn't have a specific address. So my colleague, who had visited it via the bike path, but not really walked around, used Google Maps to identify the nearest business and use that project address with a note in the description about where to find the actual work site nearby. But she hadn't actually done a full site visit of walking around the site. So she didn't realize that the address she used was that of a well-known strip club, and that the project site was not actually visible from the business's parking lot. So on the day of the event, anyone who may have missed that small note in the project description about the actual work location ended up at the front doors of a strip club without clear instructions on where to find the service project. So this underscores the importance of really physically scoping out your project site via multiple modes of transportation to ensure that you can provide clear and accessible directions and determine what signage is needed and whether you need to station somebody, in person to direct people as to where to go. Once you've done your site visit, putting together an actual map of your project site can help you think through the flow of the event and what layout makes the most sense in advance, so you're not scrambling on the day of. So in thinking through the aspects of a book drive, for example, it's helpful to identify a space to receive the books, a space for folks to actively sort through the donations received, a spot for sorted books to be bundled by grade level, and then maybe a station for completed book bundles destined for delivery. I have been a part of one too many service projects where 5 minutes before volunteers arrive, we are still rearranging tables because we hadn't really thought through the layout that made sense in advance. So having a map of the space on hand is a really helpful way to streamline your setup and service on the actual day of your event. If you have folks taking on leadership roles on the project, make sure you have a plan for how to make your leads easily identifiable to your volunteers. Clipboards, leader t-shirts, these can be helpful things in identifying your leads on the day of, and name tags that feature not just their name, but also their area of expertise on the project can be a great help to volunteers looking for the right person to talk to. Above all, make sure you have a plan to orient and train anyone in a leadership role prior to the start of the project. Take some time to ensure that each member has the information and training necessary to actually successfully lead others on the day of the event. I actually remember my first day of service project as an AmeriCorps member. I was like a month into my term. I was put in charge of leading a painting crew at a local school for a big beautification project. It wasn't until the morning that my colleagues realized I actually had little knowledge of how to use a paint roller. Would have been helpful to know beforehand. In considering your training needs, do make sure to meet on site with your team leads before the day of the event to ensure that everyone clearly understands their role in advance. And be wary if somebody says they can wing it. I made the mistake once when coming on board as a tree planting crew leader. I couldn't make it to a scheduled orientation, but figured I had plenty of volunteer leading experience, so I could just skim the 15-page crew leader guide and I'd be fine. Turns out, planting a tree in real time, way different than reading about how to plant a tree. During my shift, I managed to guide my group in planting 2 trees at completely the wrong depth and location before my co-lead caught my errors. It was an embarrassing moment and a lesson I will never forget. It's one thing to know how to lead volunteers. It's another thing to know how to lead volunteers in a very specific task. Experiential, hands-on, on-site training is often far more effective than sending folks home with a packet to read or an email to skim. So we talked a lot about identifying your project's why as you plan your event, but it is equally important to communicate that why once the event is underway. So often we get so eager to get volunteers going on their tasks that the larger picture can be lost in the shuffle of getting folks in the door. Make sure you find a way to connect volunteers' tasks with the larger mission that you are working towards and repeat it more than once, as you never know who might have missed it the first time. I have an example of this. I remember being out at one of my one of my favorite service projects, leading a work party on an educational farm for Family Volunteer Day. We planned a thoughtful orientation to get kids and adults excited about a day of weeding by talking about the educational mission of the farm, its active food box program, the absence of pesticides, and the value of having vegetables that touring children could just pluck off the vine. We underline the value of volunteers in really helping tackle fast-growing weeds and the capacity it freed up for farmers to engage in that youth education. And then we set folks off to work. Fast forward to a mom arriving late with children in tow. I welcomed them to the farm and immediately connected them with another family working to weed a patch of vegetables, encouraging the new arrivals to watch and learn from others who had already been oriented. But I forgot to tell them why we were doing it. When the project feedback came back, there was a single negative review. It was from a mom who was frustrated for having schlepped her kids across town, arriving late and flustered, only to be put on a tedious weeding task that she could have had her kids do in their own backyard. I didn't even know what the farm was all about. The best projects are the ones that underline and celebrate the why behind the work at the beginning, during the project, and again at the end to consistently make that larger connection back to the purpose of the day. So one way to ensure your volunteers think about that why is to give them time to think about what they've done and connect it back to the larger picture. Reflection can help underline the value of the work accomplished and create space for folks to share what they learned and consider opportunities to stay involved. Closing reflections can be a great activity for a VISTA leader to facilitate, whether during the project itself or with your VISTA team after the fact, as a form of debrief. A common structure for closing reflections that you might be familiar with, as it's often used in AmeriCorps programs, is the what, so what, now what model, which invites participants to reflect on 3 different levels. The first round addresses the what. We ask questions like, what did we do? What was a favorite moment you had? What did someone learn? What was surprising? Then we ask, so what? Why does this experience matter? What impact did we have? How does the work tie back to our larger why? And finally, we invite folks to consider, now what? How do you want to stay involved? What are other ways we can address the issue moving forward? This last question can help participants build that bridge to future action if they take a moment to pause and consider what they'd like to do next.
All right, so we'd like to hear from you one last time, and again, using the chat. Based on your own experience, what is a tip or a word of advice that you would give someone planning a day of service? Whether you've planned an event yourself or you've simply participated in one, and whether it went well or not, what tips or suggestions can you share? So again, we're using the chat here. It's sending to everyone. And Tammy is in with the first response. Be prepared for everything. Yeah, so you may have a particular plan in mind, but things can often go in different directions. So having contingency plans, whether it's weather, that sort of thing, but also, what if people really aren't doing what you expect? Judy writes, remember to say thank you. Yeah, absolutely, right? So people are giving up their time and energy and want to feel that their efforts are being appreciated. Alan shares, it helps to make a list and have people who are willing to help you with the planning, right? Jackie shared having a backup plan for all aspects, not necessarily planned out, but think about what could go wrong and brainstorm solutions. Annika says snacks and drinks provided, absolutely. Who doesn't like snacks? Kenneth says double check your agenda board and follow up with those who will be helping. Right. So, again, several of you have mentioned having a clear plan, and if you've delegated out tasks, knowing who's doing what, being able to follow up with people so that you can be sure that everyone knows what they're doing and is prepared and ready to go. Malia, any thoughts that come to you from seeing this great list?
Yeah, the backup plan and being prepared for all situations reminds me of a project that I came out to that the news got wind of, and we didn't know that was going to happen. So twice as many people just showed up on the day of than we were prepared for. But we had identified a couple backup projects for the day in case people got done early. So we were actually able to accommodate far more volunteers than we thought we were going to get. So having some of those backup projects on the back burner, so that if you do end up with more people, if you can accommodate them, it's also totally okay to say you needed to sign up in advance. I'm sorry, that is legit as well. But if you can accommodate more capacity or people get through tasks sooner than you think, it's really helpful to have some of those backup plans in place. Yeah, some great things, following up with your agenda, sending out reminder emails. One thing that is helpful is to include a contact number for somebody that can be reached on the day of, especially if you're out in nature doing a weed pull or something, ivy pull, and it's hard to find the location. Who's going to be the point person that has their phone turned on so that, if somebody gets lost, they have somebody to call. So yeah, lots about clear communication for sure. These are all great examples, and I hope that they kind of flesh out some of the ones that we've already talked about today. All right, Andy, I think you might have another question.
Yeah, we do. So we want to give you a chance to see how well you've been following along. You'll see a question on the screen here. You should see a little pop-up window and ask you to take a moment to identify the most important element of planning a service project. Is it conducting a site visit, identifying the desired outcomes for the project, including a closing reflection, or is it offering thank you gifts for the volunteers? I'll give you just a moment to respond. And it looks like almost half of you have already got your answer in, be sure you click the submit button so that your response gets tabulated. And in just a moment, we'll see how everyone did. I'll give you like 5 more seconds to get your response in. We've got about 2/3 of everyone who's done, but just don't want to miss anyone there. All right, we will go ahead and close the poll. And looks like almost 80%, 78% of you got this one right. So the correct answer here was B, identifying the desired outcomes, right? That's another way of saying the why for the project. All right, thank you so much for participating in that activity. And now we're going to get to your questions in just a moment. I want to thank Malia for a really informative presentation. Before we get to the question and answer, we want to invite you to share your thoughts on this webinar by completing a short evaluation survey. Your feedback will be really important for Malia, and it's also helpful for me as I'm always looking for ways that we can make these webinars most useful for you and other VISTA leaders. The survey is probably open already in your browser window behind Zoom, but if not, we have shared the link there in the chat. All right, so now it's time to see what questions you may have. I haven't seen any questions so far, but want to invite you again to use the chat to submit a question for Malia. Anything that we've talked about so far around service project development, feel free to drop that into the chat. And we've got a few minutes to cover those questions. All right, looks like Jamie has a question. If you would go ahead and type that in for us, that would be great. And while we're waiting on Jamie, Aria says, I have a question about planning some education-based service opportunities around Juneteenth. All right, so is there something more specific in your question, or are you just looking for general advice? You can clarify that.
I can at least kind of start to answer with a few ideas.
Sure.
So one of the things that we did was kind of rethink how we were approaching our Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service. In the past, it had been a little bit of a just general focus on service and general focus on getting out into the community. And we did end up pivoting it to be more of an education-based opportunity that really centered racial justice rather than kind of making it a more general volunteer day. And we worked to build relationships with Black-led organizations in our area and really kind of looked to them and also paid them for their knowledge in teaching and bringing some of the education to the students that we had in our program, so that we really centered the education piece. I think big days of service, oftentimes we think of the service component, but really expanding our idea of what service means to include having dialogue, having education, building understanding is a very important piece of that. So I would reach out to some of the organizations that you have in your area. I would figure out what budget you have to pay people to come in and be educators with that. And kind of see what knowledge is and expertise is there in your community that you can invite other people to be a part of.
All right, great question, and thank you, Malia, for that response. We've got a few more that have come in. Judy asks, what are some of your favorite fun service projects that might lift the mood of VISTAs who are giving a year doing other really difficult service?
Ooh, that's a good one. So one of the things that I have really enjoyed doing, and I think the volunteers that I've worked with have enjoyed it as well, is we do a project called Cards for Seniors. We partner with the local Meals on Wheels organization and create handmade cards to provide in the meals that go out with the meals to seniors, and we can write like a handwritten note inside, share a story of our day, include poems, include fun quotes. And it creates a volunteer opportunity where we can come together and do an art project essentially that a lot of people find really like meditative and relaxing. They get to just sit there and focus on art. We might theme it. So we did one around Valentine's Day. We did one that was kind of springtime themed. So folks come together and they're able to sit and connect and chat and kind of relax a little bit and have some of that fun. We put on some music, but then also we started out by talking about senior isolation and why an organization like Meals on Wheels exists. So we do some of that education piece. We want to make sure that the cards that we're making, are appropriate and will be uplifting to those who receive them. But then we can kind of sink into some of that fun piece. So that's one of them. Other fun projects, I would say that creative energy. We've done mural painting projects in the past, which take quite a bit more work, but on the day of can be a really fun opportunity for people to come together and, get paintbrushes and create something really beautiful.
Great ideas, Malia. And I would just add to that projects that I've been involved with my colleagues here at VISTA. Some of the ones that were the most fun were ones that we didn't have to organize ourselves. So it was really partnering with another organization. And Malia, you talked about this earlier. Like there are some great organizations here in DC. There's a food bank that they're super well organized and they have all these opportunities. And so it was really fun. All we had to do was basically pick the day and show up, and they took care of everything else. So that took a lot of the load off of us in terms of putting it together. And we had researched and we knew that this organization, as you were saying, had a very strong education component. So they helped us, learn more about food insecurity in the nation's capital and understand what the role of food banks. It's not the solution, and they're very clear about like this is not our best answer as a society for this, but it's a short-term resource that is essential for people. So that was great, and of course, the thing that oftentimes folks are looking for is really just that togetherness, that opportunity to be with others and to work collaboratively in somewhat structured ways that aren't stressful. So just another idea there. All right, we've got one more from Kenneth. How can we find quick tools to apply to our efforts that may be more specific to our cause?
Yeah, that's a really good a really good question. I think using the power of Google, if you're looking for like educational things related to a specific issue, say around food security, reaching out to kind of the local food bank, finding organizations where that is their mission and kind of reaching out to see what tools they already have available, I think is one way to go. You can also look at, like the Hands-On Network is a kind of network of volunteer centers. And sometimes the Hands-On Network has ideas for specific projects. So I would definitely use the power of both your local organizations and local resources to find kind of what already exists and go from there.
All right. Well, thank you for all of the questions. Malia, thank you for the terrific responses and information there and everything that you've done in putting together this presentation. Really appreciate everything that you've contributed here.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. And before we let our audience go, I just want to invite everyone to our next webinar. And that is happening next month, where we're going to look at ways to reduce bias in the member selection process, happening on Wednesday, June 15th. So next month we'll be off of our Thursday schedule and we'll have it on a Wednesday, but we hope to see you there. I again want to thank our presenter, Malia Hadidian-Titchener, for such an informative presentation. Also thanks to Bethany DeStablin for her instructional design assistance, and our production team today, that includes Kim Adams, Jeff Banas, as well as our captioners. And thank you for joining. We hope to see you again. This concludes our presentation.